Okay. All right.
We can
So yeah, so we can start with F5 DNS. Okay. So before starting to the course, let me just give my quick introduction. Okay. So my name is Amar and I'm associated with NetMinion since 3 years. I do have corporate experience, and if I talk about my experience, so I have 15 plus year of experience now, and I have experience on different technology like load balancer, cloud, proxy, firewall. Okay, so I would be having, I would be your trainer for this particular course, right? Here I would be covering DNS. So that's a brief about me. Okay, so I believe you guys have already experience on the F5 LTM, right? And that's why you are here for, to join the F5 DNS course, right? So F5 DNS is prior to the DNS, this was known as a F5 GTM, which is Global Traffic Manager, and now it is completely DNS because it is handling your DNS request very efficiently, and that's why F5 decided to give this module name as a DNS. Right. So if we talk about DNS, what is a DNS? So DNS stands for Domain Naming System, where IP is going to resolve into the name, or name going to resolve into the IP. So that's the DNS. So if I talk about the resolution, how resolution is happening. So for resolution, you can see that a domain system, or DNS, is the hierarchical and decentralized naming system, which would use to identify computer services and other resources which are reachable through the internet or other internet protocol. So you can see here that if you want to access any particular website or service application, so basically you are accessing them via friendly name, right? But actually that website would be running on the IP address. Okay, so memorizing the IP address, it is difficult, and that's why there is a friendly name. Okay, so DNS would be working as a bridge between user and the system. It would be resolving your friendly name into the IP address. If I talk about how resolution is happening, so resolution is happening in this way. For example, there is a system which want to access a particular website. We can take example download.beta.example.com. So first of all, that query is going to generated by the system. So this query name is a recursive query. So this is the recursive query. The recursive query is going to generated by the system. To whom? To the local DNS. As soon as it goes to local DNS is going to check on its databases whether there is any IP mapped against this particular name. If local DNS do not find that, then it send that query to the root level server. Okay, root level server means dot server. This is the root server. Okay, the query would go to dot server or root server. The root server would not contain any kind of record for this, but what it is containing, root server containing the name of the top level DNS. For example, .com, .org, those are the top level DNS. So root server would say like this, that I do not know what is the IP address of this particular website, but I know the .com IP address. You should ask to .com. So the query would go to the top level domain here. This system would query to top level domain. And now the top level domain is going to reply that it doesn't know download.beta.example.com, but it knows that who is the authoritative server for the beta.com. I mean, for example.com. Okay, so it would send the IP of the authoritative server. When I say authoritative server, that means that server would be holding all the record related to example.com, right? So it would go over here. I mean, the query would go to this authoritative server and would ask, do you know what is the IP of download.beta.com? So it would say that I do not contain, there is a subdomain of mine which is containing this. So it would give the IP of the subdomain. And now the request would go over here. If this subdomain is containing the, containing the IP of IP address of download.beta.com, then it is going to reply, yes, I am the authoritative for the beta.example.com, and I know that, if this server would be containing the download IP, beta.example.com IP, then it is going to give the positive response, else it would be giving the negative response. Okay, so if this is giving the negative response, then negative response go to this server that there is no domain, there is no IP entry against this domain name, right? But if this server would be containing the IP of download.com, so it would be giving the IP of download.beta.example.com, and this system would be directly reaching to the download.beta.example.com, right? So that's how query would work, right? So on the case of positive response, this would get the proper IP. On the case of negative response, this would not get the proper IP. So let's say there is a positive response. Let's say instead of download.beta.com, this system was requesting for beta.com, beta.example.com. On that case, this system would get the positive response, right? So whatever the server would be holding the application regarding beta.example.com, the query, this server would be sending the final request to that system only, right? Now, as soon as this local DNS is responding the IP of beta.com, beta.example.com to this requester, this would be able to cache that response as well. So if there is another system would try to, request for the same IP, it do not repeat the same process. This query, which is iterative query would not be initiated because it would resolve from the local cache, right? So that's how DNS is working, and how F5 is helpful over here. Okay, so F5 is a advanced, F5 DNS is an advanced module that can handle advanced request. For example, any DNS request, it can accelerate. Okay, I would talk about that. Any DNS request, it can cache as well, or it can protect against malicious type of DNS attacks. So I would talk about that. Okay, hopefully you got this DNS query.
I have a doubt here.
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the local DNS cache you mentioned, like how long does the cache work? Because the IP could get changed. Like if some site goes down, the IP would get changed, right?
It depends on the TTL value. What is the TTL value set for the particular record? Based on that, this is going to store the cache. So usually 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, I would talk about F5.1, how F5 DNS is working over here. Let me just write over here. So let's say this is your system, and you have local DNS over here. This is local DNS. Okay. And now here you have F5. This is local DNS server. And finally, your request is coming from the outside world as well. There are people over the internet who are requesting for the access of any particular resources. Sorry. And I would say that there are web server as well. So this is web server, which is running on, let's say 10.1.5.10 IP. Now, if your internal user want to access this web server, and this web server name is, DNS name is NetMinion.net. So this web server is running the application, which is NetMinion.net website, right? And people from internal network and people from external network both are trying to access this. So for internal network, what we can do, we can make the entry over here on the local DNS, right? So when they are going to access, trying to type netminion.net on the browser, the request to go to this DNS, local DNS server, and local DNS server is going to resolve that. But what if people are trying to access from the outside? Okay, so from the outside, you must be putting some public IP. So let's consider that you have the public IP 100.0.0.1. Against this public IP, you have made the entry netminion.net, right, over here. And this entry you have hosted on the F5 DNS. Okay, the benefit you get, first of all, your F5 would be able to do the GSLB. F5 would be able to do GSLB. When I say GSLB, that means global server load balancing. It would be able to identify that the request for this DNS is generated from where, whether it's generated from India, whether it's generated from US, whether it's generated from which location. Based on the location, your F5 would be sending that request to respective data center. So maybe behind this F5, you could have a data center, different data center. Okay, one data center you could have in Europe. So if the request is being generated from Europe, so it would be sending the request to the Europe. So similar data center would be in Europe also, same setup in the Europe. But this would be the front end. The front end, when it is receiving the request, it would be able to understand that traffic is coming from where. And based on that, it would be able to route the particular request to appropriate data center. That one thing this F5 DNS can do. The other thing, maybe your local DNS server would not supporting DNS security. Okay. So there is a DNS sec feature, which is known as a DNS security. Okay. So if you just want to, send the secure DNS request, for that you would be using DNS security. So F5 DNS having the component which is related to security, and it would be able to handle DNS security request in much better way, right? So it is supporting DNS security also. What else this F5 DNS is supporting? There is known as a DNS Express. This is supporting DNS Express. When I say Express, that means million of DNS requests it can handle without any issue, right? But if you would use any other, any other server apart from F5 to handle the DNS request, maybe that device has a limitation. okay, but not on the F5. So it can handle million of DNS requests per second, okay, and it can response within the millisecond. So for example, if these devices are, I mean, from the all over world, if the people are trying to send the DNS query to the F5, F5 can handle it very well. Also, F5 DNS is supporting DNS 624. So when I say DNS 624, that means maybe on the back end, your URL would be running on a IP version 4 and the request from front end coming on the IP version 6. So definitely your F5 DNS would be able to handle that. And also in F5 on the DNS, you can apply the I rule where you can create the custom, I would say custom condition. Okay. If the particular condition is going to match, then your F5 is going to resolve the particular query, or it would be able to redirect a particular query. So all these features would be supported by the F5 DNS. Okay. Very important feature. I mean, all are the very important feature, but mostly organization uses GSLB, DNSSEC, and DNS Express. These three features are mostly used, and also I rule in some condition, right? So yes, if some, I would more focus on this DNS Express. In DNS Express, what happened? As I told you, million of DNS requests would be handled properly, and F5 does support some profile which would be able to block DDoS type of attack over the DNS, right? So maybe this is working you as a primary. This is your primary, and F5 can work as a secondary DNS over here. So whenever you are updating any record, automatically that record can be updated here using AXFR feature. Okay, so that's the use of F5 DNS. Now I would talk about the course content that we are going to cover here. Probably you may be aware about these terminology, and if you are not aware, don't worry, we are going to cover all those things. So in these are the mainly course content that we are going to cover, right? So we will talk about DNS review and its deployment. We will review that how DNS system is working, okay, in detail. We will talk about what all the what is the big IP DNS services we have. As I told, GSLB, DNS Sec, DNS Express, okay, DNS 64, zone runner, zone transfer, all those things we are going to discuss there. Okay. Then GSLB we will talk about in detail. Okay. That how GSLB is working. So basically you would have the F5 device over here, F5 DNS device. And under this F5 DNS device, you would have a LTM in different data centers. Okay. So here on the F5 DNS, you would be configuring wide IP. Okay. And your server, actual server would be here, which would be running an application. So let's say there are server which is running an application on port number 80. Same server are here, which is running application on port number 80. And same server are here on different data center, which is running the services on port number 80. Now what would be happening? User would be hitting this wide IP, and then F5 would know that the traffic is coming from where. Okay, so based on geolocation, it would be able to distribute the traffic, whether that traffic need to be distributed in X data center. Let's say this is UK data center, this is US data center, and this is let's say India data center. So user would be hitting the wide IP, And F5 DNS would be knowing that the traffic would be routed to which one based on the, whatever the algorithm you would set for the load balancing. So it is going to send the data to nearest one. So if the user is hitting from the UK, so it would send the data to nearest data center. If the user are hitting from India, so it would be sending that query to India data center. And sometimes, let's say due to any XY reason, these server are down. So between LTM and DNS, there is a I query is running. Using I query, it would be able to monitor the health and other metric. So it would be able to understand that these servers are down. So intelligently, this would be redirecting those requests to next available data center. Okay, so that's what is the global server load balancing that we will talk. Okay, and this would happen with the combination of wide IP. So wide IP would be talking here as well. And we will see that how we can create a data center or server object. These are the physical object. So in data center, you would have a DNS server as well, and you would have these servers. So that is the physical object. So we will talk about that, how you can create data center, how you can add the server, how you can add the server over here on the LTM, and how you can add LTM as a server on F5. Not only, F5 product you can add as a server, but other product, like if you have Citrix load balancer, that product you can also add on the F5 DNS. And then we will talk about DNS pool. Okay, DNS virtual server, all these things we are going to talk. Right. So that's the course content. If you have any question regarding course content, please let me know.
So does this course chargeable, or it is like how you have to attend this course, and what is the procedure for the same?
Sorry, Radhe, do you want to cover this?
So are you going to cover today, or it will be a part of the course?
This is the part of course. All
Okay,
these things are the part of course. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So we talk about DNS services. We talk about how DNS works. Now we are going to talk about how F5 is going to take the decision that how DNS resolution should happen. Okay. So in F5, there is a listener. So let me just talk about that. So I hope you are already aware about the LTM, right? In LTM, you are already aware. So I would compare with LTM and this DNS as well. So let's understand. Let's say on the back end, you have two server in LTM, which is running on port number 80. And there is any application is running on this server, right? So let's say application is running NetMinion.net. This application is running over here, and this is LTM. What we are going to create in LTM, we are going to create a pool. This would known as a pool of server, right? And that pool is going to be added in the LTM. And on the front end, we have the virtual server, right? So user would be hitting virtual server, right? And then they are going, this LTM would be sending that request to the backend. Same thing happening here on the DNS as well. So on DNS, instead of virtual server, you are creating a listener. So user would be hitting a listener. Okay. So from here, when any user want to make a DNS query, so it would be hitting the listener, sending the request to the listener. And how listener is going to, how now the query would come to the F5. Now how F5 is going to decide that what IP to this user need to be provided. Okay. So first of all, your F5 DNS is going to check whether for particular query, there is a wide IP is configured or not. So for example, this user made a query, a DNS query for netminion.net. .net. It sent that what is the IP of netminion? The query is like, what is the IP of netminion.net? So it's sending to the listener, to the F5 DNS. Now F5 DNS would check against this netminion.net whether there is any wide IP configure. What is the wide IP? Wide IP is nothing but that is the FQDN. It's nothing. It's not an IP. This is a FQDN. So against netminion, there would be FQDN would be configured like www.netminion.net. So if this FQDN is already configured on the F5, okay, so it would be doing intelligent resolution. That means this F5 is going to send that request to the backend. I mean, send the IP of www.netminion.net, and that IP would be the virtual server IP of LTM devices. The virtual server IP of the LTM devices. So for example, when you configure wide IP, on that cases, on the F5 DNS, you would be configuring that which virtual server should be associated with this netminion.net. So netminion.net application would be running here. That application would be running over here. And against this application, there would be virtual server IP. So let's example 10.5.1.7. That's the virtual server IP. So this virtual server IP would be provided to the user, this user, that the IP of netminion.net is 10.5.1.7. So this user directly would be sending the request to this IP, and then the LTM is going to resolve that. I mean, LTM is going to provide them content. So this is intelligent resolution. The intelligent resolution is what? Let's say due to any reason, these backend server are down. On that cases, your F5 would never give the virtual server IP, right? That's why this is known as an intelligent resolution. This virtual server IP F5 would not give. Only it would give when the condition of the backend server are up. Okay, so either both are the system, backend system would be up, or only one system would be up. On that cases, this is going to provide this IP. Let's say we haven't configured this netminion.net as a wide IP. Wide IP we haven't configured. On that case, it would look for whether we have configured DNS Express. So what is DNS Express? The next, the request would go to next part for DNS Express check. On DNS Express, basically, we don't have the LTM boxes. We would have the physical DNS server, a third-party DNS server. So in DNS Express, we could have the third-party DNS server. That means on DNS Express, we have these backend server, and these are the DNS server. These are the backend DNS server. These are the backend DNS server. So what would happen? These backend DNS server would be working as a primary, and your F5 would be working as a secondary, right? So between your backend DNS server, it could be Linux based, it could be Windows DNS server. Okay, but they are the primary one. They have the all records. That means when you are making the any changes, let's say you just want to make the changes against netminion.net, you are doing over here. And when you made the changes, the replication between your F5 DNS and to the backend DNS would happen. So now what it would do, it would check whether you have a Dns Express zone is configured or not, where your F5 DNS would be working as a secondary, and whatever the records are here, all the records would be replicated on the F5. Okay. So if the entry against netminion.net is matching in the express zone, okay, then fine, it is going to. If not, let's say express zone is not configured, so it would check, go for the next step. What is this? This is going to check the cache. So F5 do has capability to maintain the cache. Okay, all the whatever the query it is resolving against those query, it can maintain the cache. So it will check whether there is any cache against this netminion.net. If there is a cache entry, so from that cache entry, it would check what is the IP against this netminion.net, and it is going to provide the IP to this one. Else there is no cache, then on that cases, it is going to do the resolving cache define. So it is going to check whether that against that query, resolving cache is defined or not. So what is the resolving cache? F5 itself is going to resolve that IP, this netminion.net IP, by sending the query to first a root server, then from TLD, okay, then authoritative server. So it is just going to create iterative query over here and get the IP against this netminion.net. So F5 DNS would start sending the query to root server, then top level domain, TLD, and whatever the top level domain is replying, authoritative server. So it is going to send that to authoritative server. And once it get the IP, not only it would resolve, but that IP it is going to do the cache and it would give over here. But let's say on the F5 resolving cache is not configured. So which condition it would go? It would go to next condition. Where it would go? It would check whether the listener which is configured here on the back end of the listener, whether there is a DNS pool. That means we create a listener. Okay, we create listener, and on the back of the listener, we add these kind of DNS server. So it would be checking that whether the listener has the DNS pool or not. If the listener has DNS pool, then fine. Else, what it would be doing? If the listener has DNS pool, so DNS query is going to be on this server, on the backend server. Else, it is going to check whether the F5 has a local bind server configure. So F5 on the F5, you can configure local DNS server. F5 you can use as a local bind server. That means on the F5 you can create the record, all the record, or whatever the DNS entry you are configuring on this server, same DNS entry you can configure on this one. Else, let's say there is no listener configure, listener do not have the pool, there is no local bind server, then it is going to check whether the listener is a self IP or not. That means the listener IP address you have configured, that is the self IP or that is something else. If the listener is not a self IP, then it is going to forward that request to particular IP, where particular IP means if not a self IP, so wherever the listener is configured, whatever the IP is configured for listener, on that IP request is going to forward. Else, let's say the listener has the self IP, you have configured as a self IP. So it would say that I'm done. I have checked all the option. Now I cannot resolve that query. So finally, if the listener has a self IP configure, so it is going to say that I cannot resolve. I'm not able to find that what is the IP of this netminion.net. So this is how the request flow or decision flow happen in the F5. So this is really important. If you understand all these terms, So DNS is really very easy because we will be configuring all these things only in the DNS, nothing else. All these 7 steps we are configuring in the F5 DNS. Apart from these, we are not doing anything. Okay, so we will show you when we do actual practical. On today's demo, I'm just going to show you that how we can create a listener and how we can bind a pool with that. Okay, so let me just go. Hopefully you already know the activation, how you can activate this F5 devices. So what I have done, this is our lab, right? This is the DNS lab, and in this DNS lab we have taken 2 data center logically. In one data center we have 1 GTM, 1 LTM, and 2 Linux server. These Linux server we would use as a web server, plus we will use these Linux servers as a DNS server, right? And here as well, we have 1 GTM, 1 LTM devices, and 2 Linux server. This is another data center. On this data center, we are going to use them as a web server, plus we are going to use them as a DNS server. So as of now, what I have done, I have configured this server as a DNS server. Okay. And this device as a GTM we have configured, which is known as a DNS. So we have configured this as a DNS. And the query which we are making from this workstation. So this workstation is an external user which would be making the query. So query would go here on this particular switch, would be hitting the external VLAN 1.2. And from that, this big IP is going to send that query to internal DNS server, to this one. And this DNS server is going to reply. And based on the reply, the DNS is going to reply to the workstation. So for example, I have configured a DNS server over here, and DNS server which I have configured on this name, F5 test1.com. This is my DNS server, right? F5 test1.com. Sorry. F5 test1.com. Right. So if I browse here, because this is the server 1, Linux server 1. So if I browse here on this system, if I do the NS lookup and would try to resolve server 1.f5 test1.com, it would be resolving this server IP. So what we have done for this London data center, we have configured the IP, internal IP 10.1.12.0 series. This is the IP for internal zone. So for this server, we have configured 10.1.12.1. So when I do the NS lookup, the request would go to my listener. So listener IP I have configured here 10.1.20.20. This is the listener IP. So the request would go to the listener, and the listener have the pool on this backend. So listener would be sending this to this Linux server, and then Linux server would be resolving the query. Okay. So what I would do, I would configure here 2 things on the practical. We are going to configure listener. Sorry. We are going to configure listener, and then we are going to configure the pool, and behind the listener there would be pool, and behind the pool there would be the server, your DNS server. So when you send the query to listener, the listener sending that query to pool, and then this DNS server pool, through the pool, that query would go to DNS server, and DNS server is going to send the response to the listener, and the listener is sending the response to the user. This is a user. This workstation is a user. So let me just go and let me show you the configuration. Let me just open the workstation, and through workstation, I would access this GTM server. So this is the workstation, and this is the IP of my DNS system. I mean, BIG IP DNS 10.1.10.20. Let me just open it. I will provide the username. Username, default username is admin, and password is also admin. Let's log in. And here, this is the DNS. So on this system, we have installed two modules, LTM and DNS as well. So I would just using DNS, nothing else. Okay. So here we have different options here. So regarding, if you want to create listener, you need to go on delivery. If you want to create wide IP, data center, etc., you have to go over here. If you want to create a DNS Express, so you need to go on into the zone. Okay. And also for the local DNS configuration, you can go over here. So if you want to configure local bind server on this system, so you can use this utility, zone runner utility, where you can configure local DNS. And this is the cache. So you can cache related settings here you can enable, and this is final setting. Okay, so any journal setting related delivery GSLV zones you can do from here. So just a pretty less option here in comparison to LTM. In LTM you have more option, but on the DNS you have very less option. So it's a really very easy to learn the DNS. Okay, so I would go here on the delivery. First of all, I would create a listener. So I would go on listener. I would let you know that for this DNS system, what all the IP we have. So I would go on the network, and I'm just going to show you the IP, self IP. So we have 10.1.12.20. This is internal. This belongs to internal VLAN. And 10.1.20.20. This belongs to external VLAN. So these are what? These are the self IP. So DNS, listener, which I would configure as per my flow. I would configure listener as a self IP. Okay, so let me just configure listener as a self IP. So here I would go on DNS, go to delivery on listener, and listener list over here. I don't have any listener so far. So if I send any query to that listener, nothing would happen. Okay, so let me just create one, and listener name I'm putting test_listener. Okay, what IP you want to configure? Okay, so single IP I'm putting 10.1.20.20, and this listener would be listening the request for what? This listener would be requesting the request for DNS. Okay, and DNS is running on which particular port? 53. By default, it can listen the query for DNS on the default port, but you can customize as well. Now, from which all VLAN this should receive the traffic? So it should receive from the external VLAN or internal VLAN. You can define over here. Right now, I'm saying that whether the request is coming from internal or external, it should listen on any VLAN. Source address translation, it should do. Yes, the source address translation it should do. Else, the request would be not going to the backend. So I would configure auto map, and the address translation I'm going to enable. Other translation I'm not going to enable. Apart from that, if I go to next option here, by default, the service, here are some service profiles. So you can see that what the protocol it would be using, UDP, because you know that DNS can be listened on TCP and UDP as well. DNS service can run on TCP and it can run on the UDP. But for all query, by default, it would be running on the UDP. Okay. And for zone transfer from primary to secondary, that would be running on a TCP, right? So by default, my query would be listening on UDP, and these are the profile for the client side, and this is the profile for the server side. By default, it would be using client profile only. And the load balancing. So if you have any pool, you can define, else you can define it later. So I do not have pool. So what I would do, I would create a pool over here. Let me just open this in new tab. And now I would create a pool. So right now I don't have a pool. I'm not going to configure any, persistency. Now let's click on finish. And meanwhile, I would create a pool as well. And that pool I'm going to attach over here. So if you see here on the backend, this is the Linux server. So this Linux server, I'm just going to add into the pool. So I have just one DNS server is configured so far in this lab. Okay. So I'm just using this Linux server only. So let's go and let's create a pool. So if you go on delivery option, and if you go here on the load balancing, you would be getting the pool option. Using the pool, you can create a DNS pool. So click on create and define the pool name over here. So I'm putting this one, DNS server pool. Health monitoring, by default DNS service is running on the DNS port. So I would taking UDP by default here as a monitoring. Okay. And further, we would go over here and we will add the server. So we have the server name. I'm just going to give server 1, or I can say DNS server 1. I can put the address. This is the server address 10.2.12.1. That's the IP of my Linux server, this Linux server. Let me just verify. I have clicked on the Linux server and I would run ifconfig to get the IP. So 10.1.12.1 is an IP over here. So I'm putting that IP to my workstation. And here, this is running on DNS port. So we can define here port number 53 and then add. Right now in one pool, we have this, right now we just have one DNS server is ready. So I'm not going to add any other. And let's finish this. So below. Server DNS server 1 existing node. Okay. I'm putting one. Let's finish. Okay, add over here and finish it. Okay, so this is the DNS pool. It would be okay in some time. And this pool we are going to call into the my under listener. So let's open the listener and go to load balancing. Here we can select the pool and this is my pool, update it. Okay, so finally my server are up. Okay, if I go back, this is a listener and this is enabled now. So how I can check that this listener is working properly and it's resolving the IP from the client. This is the client only. Generate some DNS query, and through that query we would be able to know whether my query is being resolved or not. So I'm just going to show you on the Linux server what all the DNS zone we have created, and under that DNS zone, what all the entry we have. So let me just open the Linux server, which is your DNS server. And let me show you that what all the zones we have over here. So there is a cd/etc and bind, because for DNS in Linux, bind package are being used. So I'm inside the bind. And if I run command ls, I should be able to see my zone over here. So we have zone, which is known as this is the reverse zone, and we would have the forward zone as well, forward.f5test1.com. So if I show you all the entry of this file, okay, you should be able to know that what all the entry we have. So I'm just going to show what all the entry we have in this file, forward.f5test1.com, and you can see we have some entry. Okay, so if I try to resolve server1.f5test1.com, so against server 1, I should get this IP. And if I try to resolve host.f5test1.com, I should get this IP. And if I try to resolve www.f5test1.com, I should get this IP. Okay. So let's go here on the workstation, try to search right here. So I would open the command prompt and use ns lookup utility. And here, instead of setting the DNS server 8.8.8, I would put the DNS server as a listener over here. So I would define server, and server is my listener. So I'm putting over here 10.1.20.20. That's my server. Okay, so now server has changed. Instead of 8.8.8, now this is the listener. So I'm trying to resolve www.f5test1.com. Let's see, I'm getting that IP, right? I'm getting this IP. So for example, if I try to ping www.f5test1.com, I should be able to ping, right? If I have correct DNS. Let me just go here on the network setting. Let me change the DNS IP. Instead of saying 8.8, the primary DNS I am putting here, the server IP, listener IP, 10.1.20.20, and the secondary server is the 8.8.8.8. So first of all, when I would send any DNS query, that would be resolved by this system only. Okay, so let's open the command prompt, and I'm pinging here www.f5test1.com, and I'm getting this IP. If I try to ping what other DNS record we had there, XYZ f5test1.com. Let's try to ping that. XYZ f5test1.com. So I'm able to get this IP. However, this is not reachable due to XY reason, but yes, my DNS is being resolved, right? 2.2.2.2. And finally, we have another record over here. If I try to ping server1.f5test1.com, I should be able to ping that. Ping server1.f5test1.com. I'm able to ping that. Now I would be asking you that in this decision, which particular step is being used on these steps? Which particular steps are being used right now?
Listener as a pool.
Right, listener has a pool. Okay, so you know your F5 is checked all these conditions. There is no wide IP, there is no express zone, there is no DNS cache, there is no resolve defined. So finally it check whether the listener has a pool. Yes, has a pool. So it send that traffic to the pool. On the pool, we have DNS server. In the pool, this is the pool. And in the pool, we have one DNS server, which is 10.1.12.1. So actually my request is being resolved by this particular system. So you are sending the request to F5 and then F5 sending the request back to this pool. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is all I have for demo. Okay, considering the time, I'm just going to stop over here. And if you have any particular question, you can ask me.
Just want to know that does SD-WAN support in this scenario or not?
Sorry, active
SD-WAN.
SD-WAN. Yeah, it would be supporting. I mean, any kind of DNS request, it would be supporting. That would be coming from SD-WAN or from anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that
So
protocol also supports. And even on the third party SD-WAN also, like not only F5, but even like Fortinet or Fat5 or anything would be there, right? Correct?
Yes, this is supporting. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Any other question from anyone else? All right. So if there is no further technical question, if you have any non-technical question, you can ask to Radhe. So Radhe would be able to answer that.
Let me share my screen. So guys, you are already aware, those who are our past students, that if you will go to our website, just for the new people I am telling you. Okay, if you will go to the website, there is a WhatsApp button. Okay, you just click on the WhatsApp button and you will reach us. Okay, or else you can just click on this chat button also and you can reach us. Rest about us, you can go, you can just check our all of the numbers, all of the website detail and everything, whatever you are looking for. You can go to the YouTube channel and just search for the netminion.net, and not only DNS, Palo Alto, CCI Security, CCI Enterprise, SD-WAN, ACI, and lot of technologies are there, free videos already uploaded, which are from recorded videos, which are like today's video we are recording, right? So same video will get uploaded on the YouTube. So from there also you can connect us either from the LinkedIn, either from the Facebook. Rest about this course, we will be starting this course soon. Okay, and we would be having Saturday and Sunday classes. That is the Indian weekend, I would say. So our classes would be on the Indian weekend, that is Saturday and Sunday. Okay, and timing would be 2 hours, 2 hours each day. It means per weekend you will be having 4 hours. Course duration would be around 20 hours plus. Okay, 20 hours plus, it could be 24, 22, bit like that. And we will be covering all of the things that are mentioning in the F5 DNS examination. Rest, Amar is already a working professional, having more than 15 years of experience in multi-domain, maybe I will say vendor support. Okay, he is CCI Security as well. So I would like to say that, yeah, you would be in the safe hands. And if you are looking for some another questions, please speak up.